Welcome to lecture number 22. Here we are going to talk about artwork from the very end of the 1800s into the early 20th century. We left our last discussion talking about the avant-garde. These were artists that were on the cutting edge, experimental and innovative. And that definitely applies to the next group of artists we're going to talk about. The Post-Impressionists. But actually, having a label like that, like Post-Impressionism, and thinking about it as a group of artists is a bit of an overstatement. It's more like a catch-all term with a diverse group of painters who were all influenced by Impressionism's use of color, but they didn't really have a unified style other than a certain kind of amping up of color. Seurat and Cezanne built upon Impressionism's scientific bent to examine form and the physiology of the eye. Then Gogh and Gauguin looked inward for deeper psychological truths and spiritual meaning. All of them sought an art that embraced something more substantial than Impressionism's fleeting moment. Here is Sunday at Le Grand Jatte by Seurat. Seurat was interested in color theory. He used a systematic organization of color in his work. He saw that small amounts of color juxtaposed with one another would optically mix together and form other experiences of color. He called it divisionism. A lot of people today learn about this as pointillism. Not technically the same thing, but basically. And this divisionism was influenced by advances in science. He read a book called The Law of Simultaneous Contrast of Colors that details theories of color perception, and the fact that color perception is actually relative instead of a fixed absolute. And complementary colors next to one another tend to intensify each other. Seurat wasn't really spontaneous like like the Impressionists. And though he used a similar color palette to the Impressionists, it's just that the forms dissolve in abstraction when you get close to it. You might remember the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where they visit this painting at the Chicago Art Institute, and the character Cameron, I think, gets closer and closer and closer and closer to where the whole picture is just a series of dots. Paul Cezanne was another one of the post-impressionist artists that really analyzed the visual world. And in fact, Cezanne is maybe the most influential of all the post-impressionist artists. He began his career as an impressionist, but his style grew into something very different. He wanted to make his art more solid and durable than the fleeting moment of the impressionists. He was interested in the structure of the visual world, and consequently his paintings look kind of chunky, almost as if they're chiseled from stone. And in his work, the natural world is reduced to these basic shapes of boxes, cones, spheres, cylinders. It's like a reduction of the world into these geometric solids. His compositions create an ambiguous sense of space. We're more aware of paint on canvas than we are of the imagery itself. And this becomes very important to later artists that we'll talk about in the coming weeks. And in Cezanne's paintings, we sometimes see various viewpoints of a scene simultaneously, like the ever-shifting nature of modern life. And in a sense, he was almost a proto-cubist. We'll talk about Cubism a little later, but Cezanne's works were undeniably influential to the Cubists. This painting is of a mountain that was close to his home. And he did many drawings and paintings of the same subjects over and over again. In his basket of apples, we see a juxtaposition of patches of colored brushstrokes. Forms become somewhat abstracted, composed of multiple vantage points. For example, the right side of the tabletop is on a different plane than the left. And so there's like kind of an amalgamation of different views, like we talked about. It looks like a painting, not a table with apples. In fact, it seems as if they'll fall right off the front of it. This is a painting that proudly declares its two-dimensional surface, but at the same time, with a sort of solidity in its forms and a convincing sense of mass. The most well-known post-impressionist artist, in fact, maybe one of the most well-known artists in history, is Vincent van Gogh. And he's one of two of these post-impressionists that really kind of fit into the modern stereotype that your parents warn you against if you say you want to be an artist, if you'll be broke your whole life, live in obscurity, and then die and then become famous. This is actually not a very common story at all. It rarely happens, but with the case of Van Gogh, this really did happen. He was a classic, tormented, artistic soul, desperate for a calling in life. He tried to be a pastor, and it just didn't work out. But in his duties, he was sent to a poor community, and he saw extreme poverty and started giving away his possessions. He wanted to live like his flock lived. And consequently, the church fired him for undermining the dignity of the priesthood. So he decided to dedicate his life to art. He had a short career, only 10 years, but did an incredible amount of work. And he was obsessive about it, like everything else he tried. He was entirely ignored in his day, sold only one painting during his lifetime. His personal isolation and loneliness kind of dominate his life and paintings. He always seemed to be troubled and took everything very seriously. While he was in Paris, he befriended other artists. He was even roommates with Gauguin, who we'll talk about for a time. He, famously fell in love with a prostitute, and after a fight with Gauguin, he cut off part of his ear and gave it to her. And this gift, this show of his love and dedication didn't come across in the way that he intended it to. He really had only one real relationship in his life, and that was his brother Theo, who supported him financially and emotionally right up until the end. Van Gogh's work is known for the expressive swirling brushstrokes, distorted forms, heightened color, like a lot of the post-impressionists, but also this impasto painted surface. Thick mounds of paint kind of globbed onto that surface gave it a physicality, unlike really any painter up till this time. And all of these things enhanced the psychological elements in his work, and he had a huge influence on later expressionist painters. Here we see Night Cafe, a jarring, eerie, complementary color scheme, sickly, distorted sense of perspective. And here's the hallmark thick, expressive brushstrokes, very directional. He wanted to convey an oppressive atmosphere, a place where one can ruin himself or go mad. In 1889, he checked himself into an asylum in Saint-Remy. And this is the view from his room. The sky swirls and throbs, pulsating celestial bodies. In a letter to Theo, he writes, "Just as we take the train to get to Rouen, we take death to reach a star." Maybe it was a cry for help. Here, the cypress tree is a common symbol of death and eternal life. It echoes the church spire in the distance, bridging the physical world and the heavens. There are abstract swirls of color, vibrant colors. Van Gogh eventually gets out of the asylum, but in July of 1890, while in the midst of one of his awful depressions, he shot himself in the chest. Somehow he staggered back home and there was visited by Theo, but he succumbed to the infection from the wound and died shortly after. He was only 37 years old. Paul Gauguin was friends for a time with Vincent van Gogh, but lived a very different life. Though he was the other stereotype artist we discussed, in that he lived in relative obscurity, and then got famous after he died. He also fits that sort of counterculture bohemian stereotype of the artist. He had a perfectly fine middle-class career. I think he was a lawyer, and a family, the whole 9 yards. But he never really felt a real sense of fulfillment. So he quit his job, abandoned his family, and he was desperately searching for a purer way of living. He thought that modern society has corrupted humanity. He sought the primitive, the unspoiled culture of tribal people. His paintings feature expressive use of color. His paintings were characteristically kind of flat. It had none of the built-up impasto brushwork of Vincent van Gogh. And he clearly rejected a pure kind of naturalism in his work, much more in favor of bright colors and a kind of flattened sense of space. So in this kind of potential early midlife crisis, Gauguin decides to move to Tahiti to seek out that pure, unspoiled culture he was looking for. And this self-portrait seems like a chronicle of that period from his life. There are two sides on the painting behind him in the painting, and both of them are taken from his own past works. So on the left-hand side of his self-portrait here, we see a crucifix, which is society, modern European society. And on the right-hand side, we see this primitive mask, emblematic of this more pure primitive culture he was looking for. And you can see his head turn slightly in the direction of the mask, as if he's made his decision of what he's seeking out. And also you can notice in the chiaroscuro here, that's where the light is coming from. So he's turning towards the light and away from the trappings of Europe and materialism, the art world, like all of these things. So he moves to Tahiti, but instead of a pure culture free from Western corruption, he found in Tahiti an island overrun with Christian missionaries and colonial rule. No dice. So he had to sort of invent the world he sought out. And he did so by romanticizing native culture. Today, this would likely be seen as cultural appropriation, but at that time, Western people weren't as aware as they are now. And here we see the bright, vibrant colors, the use of flattened shapes with very little modeling. And in this painting, the seed of Arioi, something like that, we see the Polynesian goddess sitting on a blue and white cloth. We see a fusion of different non-classical styles. The shapes seem almost pieced together. The pose, for instance, is a combination of the frontal and profile views, something like we might have seen in ancient Egypt. And in fact, Gauguin was looking at ancient models of art, the pre-Greco-Roman cultures that made art. And in fact, Gauguin made his opinion very clear in the quote, Greek art was a lie. So he rejected all the trappings of classicism, and therefore the Renaissance and practically everything that emerged from it since. But his life choices eventually caught up with him. He died, likely from syphilis, darn those island girls, and his art dealer friend shipped his work back to France to see if he couldn't sell them. Wouldn't you know it? He becomes a major success. Again, this isn't usually how it happens. It just, with Gauguin and Van Gogh, you kind of see the precedent for this stereotype of the life and career of an artist. Very rarely true. All right, so at the end of the 19th century, the pace of change picked up even further. There are plenty of issues at the time, of the times, to discuss. This was the fin de siècle, or end of the century, and it had this sort of feeling of apprehension and possibility all at once. The end of a century feels like a natural milestone. Of course it isn't, it's just an arbitrary number that got passed down to us. But nevertheless, dates like the turn of a century hold a sort of power in the collective imagination. Some of you might be old enough to remember the year 2000, maybe not, and all the trepidation that led up to that date change. But at the end of the 1800s is where we find ourselves in the course now. And there's an atmosphere of decadence, a celebration of the sensuous nature of aesthetic experience. European migration was one issue. If you take the rapid rise in the standard of living and birth rate in Europe, plus the colonialism that had been going on for several centuries now, that equals a huge wave of European peoples spreading across the globe. The Americas, like the United States, Canada, Latin America, got a lion's share of the people, but also Australia, Siberia, South Africa, etc. By 1900, more than 1/3 of the people in the world were Europeans. And they had spread over the entire globe, perhaps like a plague of locusts, depending on your viewpoint. We also have the creation of the German nation. This had been a group of separate states, but now consolidated and became a single, very powerful nation, along with France and Britain and Russia, etc. But being newcomers, they had a bit of a chip on their shoulder, and this becomes a big issue very soon. By now, the concept of the nation state was firmly entrenched in European consciousness. In fact, to this day, that is the most fundamental division in civilization, so much that we take it for granted, not realizing that for the most of human history, this wasn't how we were organized. But I digress. There are all sorts of scientific discoveries in this time period, like the quantum nature of radiation, the development of the model of the atom, discovery of chromosomes and genes, and an understanding of the human immune system. All of these things shook people's conception of the physical world. But the philosophical ideas from the time were even more earth-shattering. Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher. He was a professor of classical philosophy, the Greeks and the Romans, and one of the many fathers of existentialism and postmodernism. But he raised so many compelling ideas, like the concept of master-slave morality. This is like two competing value systems in the world. The classical culture, or the master reality, sees good and bad as the basic divide. You're good or you're bad. You achieve or you don't achieve. The Abrahamic faiths, like Christianity or Islam or Judaism, see good and evil as the dividing line. So you're a good person or you're a bad person, kind of. And these are two different ways of looking at right and wrong. And our society is a strange meshing together of these moral issues. Like, should we strive to achieve things, which is the master morality? Someone who achieves things is good. Someone who's good at their job, someone who rises to great heights in their business, that's good. That's part of master morality. Or should we strive to be good to one another? That's part of the slave morality. And sometimes these create a mutually exclusive situation where you have to balance these things. There's also another one of his influential constructs is something called the will to power, that you should become what you are, that happiness isn't an aim per se, but is instead a consequence of a successful pursuit of one's aims. There's also the concept of the Übermensch, or overman, or superman, which for Nietzsche was a future entity that will have evolved past the current state of humanity. Nietzsche said, man is a rope tied between beast and overman, a rope over an abyss. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not an end. And this is a very influential idea even today. Take the very popular transhumanist movement, but also think about how popular dystopian views of contemporary science fiction and artificial intelligence play on this. Shows like Westworld or Raised by Wolves. Perhaps Nietzsche's most famous quote is, "God is dead." What he means by that is that due to industrialized society, the concept of a Christian God is no longer a viable source of absolute moral principles. From now on, he said, people have to decide for themselves what is right and wrong. There is no one to hold your hand for you. Here's a quote from one of his books on the subject. Quote, "God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it?" Nietzsche had a massive influence on all segments of intellectual thought. The communists or conservatives or fascists or anarchists, radicals on all sides, bore his ideas and used them to assert their points of view. The only exception was the middle-of-the-road bourgeoisie, who he had an extreme contempt for. But because of all the radical interpretations of his philosophies, his ideas are often hopelessly misrepresented, which is a real shame. Another huge influence on modern thought was Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis. But it's so much more important than that sounds. He gave us a way to see ourselves. On the surface, it seemed to contradict common sense, but really it provided a deeper insight into the self. He refined the notion of the unconscious. So seeing the self as like a glacier, and the tip of the glacier is what we're conscious of. Our memories, our thoughts, our inner dialogue, but 99% of the glacier is beneath the surface of the water. And just like that, 99% of what makes us who we are is beneath the surface of our awareness. And in a lot of ways, this sort of explains every irrational behavior we engage in. The unconscious has a way of defending itself from conscious awareness. And so how do you get at that unconscious to either deal with your issues or to gain an understanding of who you really are, a true self-awareness? Dreams are one way to access this. They're uncensored by civilized morality and convention. They don't subscribe to cultural taboos that prevent a person from true self-exploration. Freud was wildly famous in his day. His ideas were a popular topic of conversation at parties and a huge influence on artists and writers who came after him. Aestheticism is a philosophic artistic concept summed up by the phrase art for art's sake. Artworks stand independent and are self-justifying. There's a quote by Oscar Wilde that I think is really interesting. All art is quite useless. And on the face of it, like a lot of things Oscar Wilde says, there's like kind of an irony or a double entendre there. When he says all art is quite useless, he's not saying that art is a bad thing. What he's saying is art is more than just its utility and meaning. Art goes beyond use, in practical terms. It's the pursuit of truth and beauty, the experience of the sublime through the senses. If it's simply achieving some other end, like how a person might join a band just to get chicks, or to make paintings just to be popular with their teachers and get good grades on stuff, all of those goals are extrinsic to art. They're not genuine. True art is intrinsic, without ulterior motives, experienced for the pure joy of that experience. So now we're finally getting around to some of the more significant art movements of fin de siècle culture in Europe. All of the ideas we've just discussed caused a fundamental questioning of everything once thought stable. People had an awareness that the reality was changing and there was a lack of permanence. Time is an arrow, always moving forward. By now, it was unquestionably the modern period. And modernism can be defined as an awareness of your position within a historical continuum. The artists that we remember from this time all saw themselves as the avant-garde, the leading edge, always on the forefront, the innovators. So styles, movements, all these things came on fast in an extremely rapid succession compared to all the previous epochs of Western culture. Symbolism is the first one we're going to discuss. This is a loosely tied group of artists whose work addresses psychological fears, desires, and impulses. They question the rationalism and materialism in culture and sought to tap into the unconscious mind, direct influence from Freud. Often using mysterious subject matter, they gave visual form to psychological states. This is perhaps one of the most famous of all these paintings, Edvard Munch, The Scream. Munch was a Norwegian artist whose work often featured nightmarish imagery with eerie colors and a deeply personal, subjective imagery and style. He painted more his own internal world than external reality. Here, he employs a disorienting perspective to depict modern alienation and isolation. Swirling forms seem to overpower this strange figure who's shrieking in horror. Here's his own description of the scene. My friends had left me, and alone, trembling with anguish, I became aware of the vast, infinite cry of nature. He was surely influenced by Vincent van Gogh. In turn, Munch was a huge influence on the slightly later movement of expressionism. Enter Gustav Klimt. He worked in Vienna, Austria, and was part of the group called the Vienna Secession. They held exhibitions, brought foreign and unconventional artists to town to show their work, and published a magazine. But they had no manifesto. All styles were welcome. Gustav Klimt was a controversial artist, known for his sexual escapades, but always with a discreet facade. His works, however, didn't show the same discretion as his life. They were often openly erotic and celebratory of sensuality. They were the visual manifestations of the fin de siècle spirit of decadence. This is the kiss, extremely decorative, flat imagery linked to Art Nouveau, a style popular in Europe at the time. Here is a couple embracing, but then it sort of dissolves into a shimmering pattern of light and color. This painting is done with oil paint and gold leaf, and you can kind of see, I think, the way that Klimt was influenced by a trip he made to Ravenna, where he saw Byzantine mosaics that really informed his painting style. Then we have the Fauves, or the literal translation is the wild beasts. André Derain, Henri Matisse, and others organized the Autumn Salon, which was yet another opposition to the official Salon show. That's when a critic called the young painters wild beasts, and that name stuck. The Fauves took off from where Van Gogh and Gauguin left off. They took the use of color, though, one giant step further. In fact, it represents the complete liberation of color, or color as a tool for expression. Here is André Derain's view of a Mediterranean port town. We see dash-like brushwork that kind of unify the painting. You can see, again, influence of Van Gogh, and also perhaps Seurat, with the kind of the points of color mixing together optically. However, the big difference is here he's using extremely bright colors, entirely expressive in purpose, not trying to mimic nature at all. The imagery is decorative and flat. He described his colors as sticks of dynamite. But it was Henri Matisse who was really the leader of the Fauves. Here, no doubt you've seen this painting lots of times. It's called The Joy of Life. It's a utopian scene, very stylized, abstracted imagery, very large in scale, almost 6 by 8 feet. He used complementary colors to intensify the image, and it evokes a real joyous mood. Flat, organized shapes, repeated curves create a rhythm with strong outlines and virtually no modeling at all. Here is Red Room, or Harmony in Red. And in this, Matisse ventures even further from naturalism. We see the table and the wall appear to be a continuous flat surface with decorative patterning, flattened out shapes in a simplified form. Once again, it kind of exuberant, playful, bountiful. Matisse was really the kind of the king of the art scene in Paris at this time. The next movement we'll discuss is expressionism. And here we see Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, who was part of a movement called the Bridge that formed in 1905. And it was taken from Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, humanity's potential to form a bridge to a more perfect humanity. This group was formed in Dresden, Germany, like I said, in 1905. And the work is often involves kind of brutal images of alienation. Certainly in this case, we see scary mask-like faces, dehumanized figures, harsh, severe colors. Kirchner embraced the primitive like Gauguin, believed that the effects of industrialization were harmful to people, and society had become a depersonalized, harsh, and cruel, mechanized world. And a sense of anxiety is always present. This piece represents a crowd scene in Dresden with faces of people that are really just vacant stares and hollow eyes. There's an odd perspective that creates a sense of unease. In fact, the street is almost kind of flipped upward. That horizontal surface almost feels more like a wall. The images are stacked on top of one another. And not only that, there are these clashing, dissonant colors pitted up against each other. And a sense of color was obviously, influenced by the same thing that the Fauves were influenced by, and the brushwork was very much like Munch, like we just saw. German Expressionism goes on for quite a while and is one of the first art movements to embrace the motion picture as an art form, which we'll talk about later. But let's look back to Paris again. In 1900, a young, wide-eyed Spanish artist arrives in town. He sees the French avant-garde artist for the first time and decides he's going to take over the city. He had no lack of self-confidence. He ends up becoming the most important artist of the 20th century, or arguably. Who is this? This is Pablo Picasso. Way too huge of a personality to cover in one chapter. He'll be a part of many important art movements to come. His longevity and desire to be on the cutting edge meant a whole lot of stylistic shifts in his work. He worked in relative obscurity in Paris for a while, until one night in 1907, he sets the wheels in motion to change the course of Western art. He had been working furiously to create something new, innovative. It had to be original and shocking. He had to turn the art establishment on his head with this painting. He digs deep into his post-adolescent experience at a Barcelona brothel and his fascination with African masks and who knows what else. And he creates the first Cubist painting. Presenting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. He paints what he thinks will surely be considered an avant-garde masterpiece, and with all of the groundbreaking and rules breaking and everything. He gathers his friends, a whole bunch of these avant-garde intellectual people, and unveils the painting and waits for all the praise to pour in, and it doesn't come. Even his avant-garde friends are horrified by his brutal, grotesque imagery, his harsh, angular forms, and this flattened, claustrophobic space he's created. And the larger-than-life scale made it even more confrontational. He just went too far. He turns it against the wall in shame. According to legend, he didn't even look at it again for years to come. As his friends were filtering out of his studio, hanging his head in shame, one of his friends didn't respond the same as the others. His name was George Braque. He saw something there that made sense to him. He got it. These flat, angular forms were like the fragmented nature of modern existence. The modern world called for a modern way of painting. Braque and Picasso realized they were both exploring the same visual issues. No big deal, just a complete reinvention of two-dimensional pictorial space, Cubism. That's the next real super movement in art. In fact, it might be the most important art movement since the Renaissance. If the Fauves liberated color, the Cubists represented a total liberation of the spatial world. It's original, yes, although it's kind of hard to imagine it happening without the earlier influence of Cezanne, because the Cubists really kind of pick up where Cezanne left off. Here you can see the way Cezanne composed disjointed shapes to form a cohesive, unified whole. But it's kind of the way that both artists disassemble the physical world and then reassemble it on the two-dimensional picture plane that I think ties them together. So the title of this painting translates The Young Women of Avignon, and the subjects were prostitutes in the red light district of Barcelona from Picasso's youth. They're beckoning, but hardly seductive, almost more like repulsive. Picasso had a complicated relationship with women, and perhaps this painting reveals some of that. Visually, there's a tension between representation and abstraction. The bodies are fractured, and they start to suggest multiple points of view, a little bit like we talked about with Cezanne. There's an emphasis on shape, but no modeling at all, or at least not much to speak of. And from Gauguin, Picasso got primitivism. Modernist artists, started looking to non-Western cultures for inspiration. In this case, the African Mass, because there was currently an exhibition of African art in the museum in Paris, and ancient Iberian sculptures. Both of these more, ancient cultures and quote primitive culture, were very inspiring to the artists working in the avant-garde in Paris. And primitivism was a very popular motif in modern art. But with Les Demoiselles, Picasso turns the traditional nude completely on its head. It's not beautiful or classical in any way. It's more it's more harsh and kind of ugly, but it also proudly declares the flatness of the picture plane. This is sort of like anti-perspective, and completely gone is the Renaissance kind of window of spatial continuity. And that made it an incredibly revolutionary painting, despite its initial reception. And if we look at Picasso's sort of comrade in arms, George Braque, we can see this, in this painting here, he creates a synthesis of memories of watching a Portuguese musician. It's a monochromatic palette of relatively muted colors, which makes a real big distinction from what we've seen recently with the really vibrant colors. And it's unified by short dash-like brushstrokes. We have a geometric fragmentation of space. Generally speaking, Cubists favored monochromatic palette at a certain point so that color wouldn't overwhelm the form. We see stenciled letters and numbers that refer to the outside world. Ostensibly, this is a painting of a man and a guitar, but ultimately that's entirely ambiguous. And the eye is always moving, darting from one glance to another. And again, we have more overtly here the multiple points of view that defy the spatial coherence of the image. Cubism was the first new system of representing form since the Renaissance. And it's hard to overstate its significance. And while all this was going down, music and dance were making revolutionary strides as well, in the form of ballet. Igor Stravinsky and Václav Nijinsky collaborated to create The Rite of Spring. Stravinsky was the composer and Nijinsky was the choreographer and dancer. Both of them were Russians who lived in Paris. We're going to listen to a section of the music from that. And this ballet premiered in 1913 and was performed by the famed Ballet Russe. It featured complex staccato rhythms and dissonant sounds with violent, jerky movements of the dancers. The story is about a pagan ritual where a girl dances herself to death as a sacrifice to the god of spring. And this was really a radical departure from the norm in ballet and in music. The harsh brutality was not all that different from Picasso's Les Demoiselles. Parisian audiences, for the premiere, the audience in Paris showed up to hear a classical ballet, and they did not get what they expected. According to the legend, partway through, some people in the audience started shouting obscenities at the performers. And pretty soon there were fistfights in the aisles, and it became a full-fledged riot. Police showed up, tried to calm the situation down, but the whole rest of the performance was a mess. Have a listen. Meanwhile, in Munich, Russian expats in Germany formed the Blue Rider Group. Vasily Kandinsky and Franz Marc were two of them. And this name was based on the image of the Blue Knight, who is St. George, on the city emblem of Moscow. And the Blue Rider were lumped in with Expressionism, but they didn't really have the same kind of pessimism that the artists from the Expressionism group had. In fact, they weren't really pessimistic at all. They were concerned with the spiritual, and they wanted to convey the spiritual through art. Wassily Kandinsky was the first well-known artist to embrace non-objective imagery in the European art tradition. Non-objective means it has no reference to the physical world. Others had done it. In some cultures, that was all their art was. But none of it was ever done so literally within the context of the Western art tradition. And that's what made Wassily Kandinsky special. Non-objective, in fact, as a term, was invented by Kandinsky to describe an art with no immediate reference to objects seen in nature. This is subtly different, as we talked about the very first week of the course. It's subtly different from the term abstraction, which is technically stylized imagery derived from real-world sources. Non-objective art is like pure abstraction, where there are no connections whatsoever to the visual world. It becomes completely its own reference point. It's as Kandinsky would say, it's absolute freedom from anatomy or anything else of the kind. It must be given to the artist in his choice of means. And that was from his book Concerning the Spiritual in Art. So there's a legend of the first non-objective painting. And I think I might have told this story the very first week of class. But anyway, here it goes. He was working one day in a studio and set his painting down to take a break and then walked away. And then as he walked back by, he stared at and looked at it and didn't realize what he was seeing. He was utterly perplexed, and then realized it was a painting just on its side. It's like, oh, okay, I see what it is now. But what he realized in that moment of searching and not being able to label, not being able to pin down what he was seeing, that was an experience of pure looking and pure experiencing. And that was what he was trying to get at. And there's also a spiritual basis of this, grounded in the mystical belief of theosophy that was very popular at the time, and saw art as an intuitive form of religious expression. He wanted to translate the most profound human emotions into universally comprehensible symbols and visual sensations, using color, shape, line, etc., pure forms. Often his works had titles that referenced musical scores. This particular one, Improvisation 28, very much like how a musical piece might be titled. He regarded visual experience in the same way as an auditory experience could be perceived. He believed that art and music were inextricably linked. And in this sense, I think it kind of like, if I could try to make this more comprehensible, think about the way you can listen to a piece of music, whether it's whatever, regardless of what the style is. Imagine yourself like maybe back in junior high, and you've got headphones on, and you're lying in your bed, and you're like brooding about the whole world, and this music coming through your ears is so profound of an emotional experience. And this is regardless of whether or not there are lyrics, or whether or not you can even understand the lyrics, or whether or not the lyrics even pertain to what you're going through. The music itself, the sensation of the tone, the chords playing together, the alignment of these auditory frequencies creates a sense of pleasure, yes, but also a profound sense of meaning that goes beyond whatever the lyrics are saying. That's what Kandinsky was getting at with his visual imagery. Now, this particular painting isn't all that non-objective. We could look at other ones that where they're even more devoid of anything that might be reminiscent of something in the world. Like here, you can almost see like kind of maybe mountaintops, maybe clouds, maybe towers, maybe eyelashes. I don't know, but his work started veering really towards this like pure abstraction at this point in time. And this really paved the way for the first American contribution to the Western art tradition, which we're going to talk about later, quite a bit later on, after World War II. That's abstract expressionism. But there's a deeper spiritual reality, and in that direct contact with reality that can be established through intuition, meditation, revelation, or any state transcending normal human consciousness. And that's really what Kandinsky was trying to do. So let's quickly recap what happened in the first years of the 20th century. One by one, the great rules, quote, rules of art have fallen in the service of progress, modernity, and the avant-garde. The Fauves broke all the rules of color, using it as an expressive tool. That's all it had to be. It didn't have to be fictive. It didn't have to describe nature in any way. The Cubists broke all the rules of shape and depth and space. They kind of flattened picture plane and created multiple viewpoints simultaneously, totally turned upside down the notion of a painting as a window on a scene that you would look at, a continuity in the spatial situation. Kandinsky then broke all the rules of imagery. So now a painting doesn't even have to be a picture of anything anymore. What's left to break? Where can an artist go if they want to push the envelope? Well, luckily, or maybe, there wasn't really that much time to question that. The second decade of the 20th century brought a calamity that nearly all of humanity is still reeling from. An event so awful that it spawned conflicts that are still playing out right now and maybe will never be resolved. I'm talking about the Great War, World War I. So after finishing that lecture, I realized there are a few images that would be really good for you to have seen. And so I'm just going to present a couple of them here. Perhaps on this one, you get an even greater sense of the pure, non-objective nature of some of Kandinsky's work. Kandinsky reflects some of the influence of Sigmund Freud that we talked about earlier, in that part of achieving like a clarity and truth involves bypassing your conscious awareness. Interestingly, in more recent years, an artist who has kind of newly risen to awareness in art and culture is Hilma af Klint, who, was, as the slide says, was a Swedish woman who predated Kandinsky's first pure abstraction. But upon her command, they were kept hidden from view until 30 years after she died. And so nobody could have known that perhaps, she might have been a forerunner even before Kandinsky in terms of moving toward a pure, non-objective art within the Western art tradition. Kandinsky was a world-famous artist when he started working this way, so consequently his influence was felt more profoundly. And there were others other than her as well. There was even an American who was kind of working this way before Kandinsky, but of course nobody paid attention to what happened there. Not yet. They will soon. It's sort of criminal I didn't mention Marcel Duchamp and his nude descending a staircase in the context of this lecture. He becomes much more important as an artist after this time period, or rather at least in a different kind of modes of art making. But he was originally a painter and did works like this that were, this particular one caused like a huge controversy when it was presented in the United States of America. And in fact, it was part of a show that was the first time the avant-garde artists from Europe were even exhibited in America, and created a huge stir. But one American art critic described this work as how was it, like shingles in an exploding shingle factory, or something like that. We'll talk about Marcel Duchamp a lot in future lectures. And another art period from this time that I am kind of feel remiss in not mentioning is Futurism. There's probably a reason why I didn't want to mention it, but this is an early 20th century movement that championed war as a cleansing agent and that celebrated the speed and dynamism of modern technology. Futurists found beauty in speed and mechanical inventions like automobiles, machine guns, etc. And a number of, like, Italy was kind of the center of it, and Italy at this time is in huge turmoil. There's a rift between the rich and the poor, and poverty on a massive scale, and a lot of people had died in a recent earthquake, widespread illiteracy, and the poet from Milan, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, wrote the Futurist Manifesto that was published in a Paris newspaper. He attacked everything old, dull, and feminine, wanting Italy to be freed of tradition and embrace the look of technology based on trying to capture the spirit of the age. He had a vision of the Italian future that, on one hand, I guess was kind of optimistic, but it also was a precursor to fascism. And this kind of fascistic attitude that saw war as a good thing. Marinetti said, "We will glorify war, the only true hygiene of the world." Yeah, so it makes it tricky to kind of talk about the context. But artists can be shitty people too, or maybe you even believe the same things that he believed there. There's certainly a lot of people right now who do. This particular iteration of Futurism almost looks kind of comical to our eyes, almost like this cartoon dog like running. But you know, at the time, it's kind of a cutting edge, like kind of embrace of figures moving, trying to capture the sense of motion in space. And this reflects the futurist interest in motion and speed, the sense of moving objects constantly multiplying and shifting, the effect of motion by repeating the forms of the feet here that are overlapping with one another. So it's complicated, and certainly everything that was going on in art and society at this time period was very complicated. We're going to go into World War I and its effects in our next lecture, and it'll get kind of dark at times, but that's just how it is. It's also going to be, there's going to be a lot of beauty, truth and beauty to come as well. So thank you for hanging with me, and I hope you have a great evening, and we'll see you next time.